welcome to season 3 of the Culture Stew podcast.
So, Dr. Rehman Abdulrehman, thank you so much for joining us on Culture Stew. I'm really excited to get the chance to talk to you.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I'm looking forward to this.
So, my first question is one that I ask all my guests. What messages did you receive early in your life, right? Just thinking about your values, your identity. What were some of the messages that influenced and shaped how you live your life today? And I know you have a very interesting backstory, so I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Well, it's interesting. Usually when we think about the messages we get as children or growing up, we think about the very direct messages, the metaphors, the parables, the things teachers or parents might have taught us. But for me, I think that there's two types of messages. There's the implicit message, and then there's the very direct message. And so I was born in Dar es Salaam. My family is Zanzibari by ethnicity. And but I grew up in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. And so there was a lot of implicit messages there. It was a colonized country. It was certainly very multicultural. And there were some really positive messages there, messages about diversity, about acceptance of different ways of being and living. But then the colonized aspect, of course, too, had an impact as well, too. I went to a British school, and implicit messages there, were that if you are white or if you're British, then you're better. If you have lighter skin, then you're more attractive. And also the concept of, how much worth people put into people's being. So my name was Abdulrehman. And I think the messages my family got, my great grandfather shortened it to Rehman or Rehman, because he thought it was too old fashioned. So he had clearly been influenced as well too. And that stuck with me, right? So my family all calls me Abdulrahman, but on paper it's Rehman, or what people say Rehman. So that stuck with me. And those are those implicit messages that I think not just I have, but I think most people of color have, regardless of whether they were, born in North America or elsewhere. There is an implicit message for people of color that leaves us as second-class citizens that we don't recognize. And that's, I think, due to the systemic racism. But the very clear and overt messages for me, I think also based on those experiences of being an immigrant in Canada, was that I got to work hard, right? There was no room for error. And the reason for that is my parents faced a great deal of racism here in Canada, and there wasn't a lot of room for error. And, most immigrants will tell you, their parents will talk about they've got to be a professional, or more specifically for anybody who comes from a similar background as me, whether it's an Arab or South Asian or even some African and East Asian cultures, is that you've got to be a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer. So my father, but I didn't have those choices. I was supposed to be a doctor. That was it. That was it. My parents had 3 boys. We were all supposed to be doctors. And so there was but not only because my parents wanted us to be helpful in society, but my father told me once he because of the racism that he faced, and he worked in sales and in business, he said, you have to go into a profession where people need you, because if you're not needed, you'll be discarded. He goes, look at me. He goes, I've been discarded numerous times despite my skills. And he's very successful. He owns his own business now. But it took a lot for him to do that. And he had to have a lot of employment opportunities canceled on him because he was a person of color. And he goes, I don't ever want you to face this. So if you're needed, no one can ever fire you. He goes, nobody's going to fire their doctor because you're needed for health. So that's the message I got very early on. And it certainly has stuck with me. And I think a lot of people of color, a lot of immigrants will have that message driven into them, that they have to work harder than the average person because they need to be noticed. And it's actually called something. It's called I forget the name of it, but it basically lasts 3 generations for immigrants. that this push, this. So I know I'm pushing my kid, and he'll probably push his kid. So it's going to last a few generations before it peters out. So those are some of the messages that I got very early on, and that certainly impacted me personally and professionally.
I love that you separated that into the explicit and the implicit messages, because I think sometimes those are in alignment and sometimes they're not, right? And so what we internalize from both of those areas, what sticks, and how does that determine some of the way that we perceive ourselves, the decisions that we make in terms of, like you said, your career, and the backstory behind that. I think it's really interesting. I am also the child of an immigrant family, so that idea of pushing and overachieving and having to prove yourself, I think it was probably a little bit less forceful in my life because I present as white, right? I can fit in with your, the white dominant cultural norm in the United States, blonde and green-eyed. And so the difference is underneath the surface. But definitely, I think that idea that you have to prove yourself and you have to overachieve was something that was very clearly and explicitly shared in my family.
Where did your parents immigrate from, if you don't mind me asking?
So my dad's family immigrated. They actually came from Turkey in the 1920s. They were Armenians. And so during the genocide, they had to flee Armenia to flee Turkey. And then the US had closed its borders to the refugee populations at that time because so many were coming over. And so they landed in Cuba. So my dad was born in Cuba. So they were sort of refugees twice over by the time they came to the States.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
It makes a really significant difference. And it's interesting. I speak to friends and colleagues of mine who are immigrants or children from immigrant families who present as white. And I do a lot of work with immigrants who come from Europe. Mm. And the internalized message is very interesting, right? Because I find them needing to put aside not their ethnic identity, but their cultural identity.
Yeah.
It's like because you present as white, you must behave in a way that fits with white culture here in North America. And I find a lot of them having a second thought, doubt about their cultural identity and them needing to package that away.
Yeah.
Whereas if you present as a person of color and you're an immigrant, people expect you to be different.
Yeah.
You are the perpetual foreigner. And so it's a different set of conflicts I've found for immigrants, whether they pass as white or not.
Yeah, absolutely. Different forms of assimilation that are expected. Yeah. I think, it sounds to me like that also, for me, those internal and implicit messages around just carrying this sort of under the surface identity of otherness and oppression, right? My family often would talk about how, they were almost wiped off the face of the earth. Yep. And so I think that had a significant impact on the choices I made professionally and in my, my work and how I see this not just as a career, but really, I often tell people, I feel like this is a call to action and I'm, not trying to be self-congratulatory, but I feel like it is my role in this world to help to build connections, to be a voice for bringing people together, but also for calling attention and bringing to light some of these inequalities. Because even though I didn't necessarily experience that level of discrimination or otherness the way others have, I've seen it and I'm sort of, adjacent to it. And so I think that's always kind of been something that's a deeply held value for me. And I'm just curious, it sounds like that similarly for you, that there was a call to action for you in terms of your professional career.
The Culture Stew podcast is a product of MSM Global Consulting and produced by Shelby Rowe Productions. Please give us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform so other people can find us. There are many ways to connect and keep the conversation going with us. Check out our website at www.msmglobalconsulting.com. You can also share your thoughts with us directly by emailing info@msmglobalconsulting.com and putting Culture Stew in the headline. Follow us on Instagram at MSM_global, Facebook at MSM Global Consulting, Twitter at Global MSM, and LinkedIn at MSM Global Consulting. Let's keep the conversation going.